I had a rush there at the end of the last video, part 2, so I just want to go over that a little more carefully here in part 3 and correct one mistake that I made before. I said something about when you're dealing with an accusation, somewhere in the middle of the last video, I said when you're dealing with an accusation, what we're really looking for is a pattern of evidence, and I said outside the Gospels. That was a mistake. I didn't mean outside the Gospels. All the evidence is in the Gospels. But as far as the accusations in the Gospels go, if you want to establish any of them, what you're looking for is a pattern of evidence outside the accusations. Is there a pattern of evidence in the Gospels, but outside the accusations, that would support the accusation that Judas was a traitor, or that would possibly contradict and undermine the accusation? That's what you're looking for, and that's what New Testament scholars never do. They all assume that Judas was a traitor. They all assume the accusation, and assume this accusation can never be broken. You can never go against it. You know, New Testament scholarship is a one hypothesis town. The real guilt hypothesis for Judas, for Jewish leaders, that's the only hypothesis they will tolerate. And that's what you do at a witch trial. You allow only one hypothesis, right? But in good scientific investigation, you're looking for other hypotheses as well, especially when you know that under the present hypothesis, the evidence is a mess. So you have to consider a second hypothesis, for example, that Judas was an innocent man slandered as a traitor, and ask, does that hypothesis explain the evidence better? All right, so as far as that ambiguous evidence goes, I made an assumption against the self-interest of my own argument. I said, let's assume that paradidomi has a secondary meaning of betray. That's the Greek word that means convey or deliver. Even if someone who disagrees with Klassen Brown would have to admit that convey or deliver is the main meaning of the word, better than 90% of the time, better than 95% of the time. That's what paradidomi means in Greek literature. So if you think that paradidomi has a secondary meaning of betray, you're picking a very slight secondary meaning, fine, and I'm willing to make that assumption against self-interest of my own argument. But you have to be able to justify picking a secondary meaning, and they can't do it. Where are the elements, the definite elements of a story of betrayal, like motive, conflict, denunciation after the fact? Where are those elements that would justify you using the translation of betray? They aren't there, and you have to justify a secondary translation. So the best argument you could make about paradidomi, by the way, the best argument you could make if you're trying to prove Judas was a traitor, is that this is an ambiguous word. So what do we have in Mark? We have him using not the word that means betray, prodidomi, we have him using the ambiguous word paradidomi. We have him giving us the ambiguous information that Judas got up, left the table, and returned with authorities. They could, for example, imagine another hypothesis where Jewish leaders and Judas were trying to save Judas from a Roman execution. And in my book, True Jew, that's true, T-R-U-E, Jew, J-E-W, I go through all the evidence in detail and explain that hypothesis is the one that will best explain the evidence. But just for the moment, even without proving anything, suppose, for example, they had a positive intention of trying to help Jesus. That would fit the information that Judas got up from the table, left, and returned with authorities. Because Mark never says he did it for the purpose of betraying. It's ambiguous the way Mark presents it. And similarly about the money, we imagine that Mark asked for the money. We imagine that Judas asked for money from the priests. Not in Mark. Mark never says that. In Mark, the priests offered Judas the money of their own accord. Mark never says that Judas asked for it. And while he tells us that the priests were glad to receive Judas, that is, when Judas came to them, he never says why they were glad. There could have been a very positive reason on behalf of Jesus why they were glad that Judas came to them. The important point to make here is that Mark never gives the specific reason for their being glad. He leaves it out. He puts everything in a neutral, ambiguous way. And that includes the statement which is put into the mouth of Jesus in Mark's Gospel. And by the way, all this information about Judas that I'm discussing in Mark's Gospel, most of it, I think, or all of it even, is in Mark 14, chapter 14. So what we have is, we have Jesus supposedly saying about Judas, it were better for that man had he never been born. And we all assume, that means somebody had a negative opinion of Judas, that he did something bad. But in ancient Hebrew, that wasn't the only meaning of that saying. We have in the book of Job wishing he had never been born. Why? Because of the afflictions that were later visited on him. And in chapter 20, which is probably an even more pertinent example, in chapter 20 of the book of Jeremiah wishes he had never been born. Why? Because of all the mockery and calumny aimed at him. It were better for me had I never been born than to endure such vicious attacks. And see, that's the kind of thing that would justify a statement like better had he never been born. If something, not that the person did something bad, but that something bad happened to or was done to that person. For example, a false accusation. If Judas had been falsely accused of betraying Jesus, that would justify the statement, better for that man had he never been born than to endure such an ugly fate, to be falsely accused of betrayal. But we never think about the other hypothesis. The point is, Mark gives it to us in an ambiguous way. He doesn't give us anything in a definite negative direction. Every chance he has, by the way, to spin this in a definite negative direction against Judas, he doesn't do it. He doesn't take up the challenge. He presents everything ambiguously without any definite negativity stated there. And yet we all assume the negativity should be read there. Like in Matthew, the only gospel, by the way, which reports that Judas committed suicide. We imagine, well, he must have felt guilty over betraying Jesus. But another possible explanation of suicide is that he felt ashamed of being falsely accused. That would explain that detail as well. I, by the way, have my doubts whether Judas committed suicide. But point is, we're never really told the reason why. So it could be because he was ashamed of the false accusation. Then there's also the famous kiss of betrayal. Well, that's what we call it. That's what scholars have called it since the beginning of time. But Mark never calls it the kiss of betrayal. He says he kissed him for a sign, but he never says what the sign was for. It could have been something very positive for Jesus, or something very positive between Judas and Jesus. Mark never says that he kissed him for a sign for a very negative reason. Every chance Mark has to make this into a definite negative story, he doesn't do it. It's an ambiguous story. He doesn't try to make it a better case of a story of betrayal. He refrains from doing that completely. And the really killer argument, the clinching argument, is simply this. If someone you knew, if someone you loved, say someone in your family or a friend, if someone you loved dearly, was convicted of a crime based on evidence like this, you'd go out of your mind. You'd go crazy. I mean, you would move heaven and earth to undo this terrible injustice. And yet we do it to Judas. Why? Because we have the power to do it, because he's long dead and we can do whatever he likes and nobody's going to rise up and complain. We can get away with it. You wouldn't tolerate it if it was done to anybody else, anybody in your family, anybody you love. But we have, the scholarly world has this absolute arrogance to do it to Judas. The crappiest evidence you can imagine. And they say, yeah, Judas was a traitor, on unbelievably bad evidence. And my complaint here is against gospel scholars, historical Jesus scholars. The gospel authors did as honest a job as they could, and they never told us half the things the scholars say they say. Yeah, something is happening here, and you don't know what it is, do you, Dr. Scholar? So, right, I'm going to get to something important next time, something my friend Susan asked me. Why is all this so important? I mean, so what, even if Judas was innocent? Well, she didn't phrase it exactly that way, but if Judas was an innocent man, why is it so important to establish that? And I'm going to answer that, or make a stab at an answer, in part 4. And I'll see you next time, amigos y compañeros. Thank you for sticking with me this far anyway.